Older adults lose billions of dollars to exploitation and scams. So obviously, it's a huge problem. If you're helping care for aging parents or aging loved ones, you need to be helping protect them from exploitation. If you're an older adult yourself, you should be on the lookout for people who want to take advantage of you. I feel so lucky that I have Shannon Miller here, who is an elder law attorney who can share some tips on how to protect against exploitation and fraud. Shannon, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
So, I'm sure as an elder law attorney, you've probably seen examples of this in real life. I'm hoping you can share some of these examples.
Sure. You know, many examples. I would say some of the most common examples are caregiver really kind of coming in and exploiting someone who's vulnerable. We often think about the exploitable brain, which is different than, someone being in a bed, unable to care for themselves. The exploitable brain can be someone who appears very normal. They can drive, they can go to the grocery store, they can live independently, but they may not have the ability to assess risk or to tell the difference between the truth and a lie. And we know from the science that the exploitable brain is really like a thinning of the cortical insula, which is this part of the brain right here. So, it's not obvious to the human eye. You can really only see it under MRI. But what we find is that person who is having some of that exploitability is very suggestible. So a lot of times that person, whoever speaks the loudest to them and the most frequently, that becomes their belief system. So exploitation is rampant, as you know, in the United States. We're talking $50 billion a year that is going out to scammers and exploiters. And we know that really like 1 in 5 people over the age of 70 has been exploited. The average dollar amount for exploitation we know is somewhere between $15,000 for your online scam to like $50,000 for like a caregiver or family member committing that act. And usually the victim is exploited 7 times before anybody takes notice. So it's really bad. Some examples of exploitation that I've seen in my practice, we had a gentleman who was from New York who had come to Florida, and he was exploited over 10 years to the tune of $10 million by a family member. Yeah, it was really sad because he was a brilliant man. But again, his brain started to change. At first, it was small amounts that were going out. And then over the course of about 10 years, he lost over $10 million. And so some of the other scams that we've seen some very sophisticated scams involving, like we had one where it was a veteran, decorated Korean War veteran. And I'm allowed to say his name because he told me tell his story as much as possible. He passed away after he was exploited, but Mr. McCadden was exploited by his daughter, who actually set up a trust that was a trust in his name, but didn't benefit him. So all of his money went into this trust, but he wasn't the beneficiary of his trust. He was actually kicked out of his home. She cut off all of his income, and he ended up being on something called aid in attendance through the VA, which is for the poorest of the poor. So, we've seen a lot of really terrible things happen to people. And what I always, go back to in the course of my own experience in dealing with exploitation, since I was a very young lawyer, is that exploitation really, it's not just about losing your money. What happens emotionally to the victims of exploitation is that they feel very traumatized, they're embarrassed. They also feel, usually it's a victim that they know. I'm sorry, the exploiter is someone that they know. And so they don't always want to prosecute the case against the exploiter. And so then they're in a situation where they have no money. They don't want to recover the money that's been stolen from them. And they suffer a lot medically. And oftentimes we will actually see a death event And typically, it's so stressful. Like, how am I going to pay my bills? Like, how did this happen to me? How come I couldn't defend myself? All of those things create really a perfect storm for our victims to be in suffering. That's a
That
lot, right?
it's so tragic. I want to go back to a number that you mentioned though, that victims are often victimized 7 times. There's 7 events before it's even noticed. So what are some signs that adult children should be looking out for that their parents might be victims?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So often what we see is a change in behavior of that parent or loved one. They may become more secretive. They may hide things like bank statements, whereas before they might have been very open about sharing their financial situation. They may change banks. They may change where they have their accounts. And then we'll notice that bills are not getting paid. So, or bills are getting paid 1 or 2 times more than they normally would be, because with the exploitable brain, oftentimes we'll also see, a lack of ability to kind of manage. So in addition to things related to finance, we'll also see other things start to happen, perhaps a lack of personal care, perhaps some things that you just kind of shake your head and go, that doesn't seem right. They're getting very thin. Why aren't they eating on a regular schedule? So we can see a decline cognitively at the same time that we may see that exploitability kind of develop at the same time. They often go hand in hand. So forgetfulness, but when an active exploiter is involved, so we have a perpetrator who has targeted our loved one, they will isolate that person. So we've seen situations where, a neighbor comes on the scene and all of a sudden mom doesn't want to return phone calls. We had a case recently where the exploiter actually got a lock on our little lady's fence, and he was the only one with a key. And all of a sudden, all of her real property was titled in his name. I mean, you can't make it up. But that isolation, the lies that are being told, such as, I'm the only one who cares about you, your children and loved ones have stolen from you, just a real, it's a very meticulous process that someone who is experienced at exploitation, it's like they go to training school and they learn how to really kind of establish trust. And then they start this whole process of lies. Your children stole from you. I'm the only one that will keep you out of a nursing home facility. They want to put you in a nursing home. Those kinds of things that are, we know there's not a single client who comes into my office that says, I want to go to a nursing home as soon as possible. So that's one of the biggest fears that our seniors kind of grapple with on a daily basis. Like, they don't want people to know that they're having financial difficulty or medical difficulty, because they want to maintain their independence. They want to be with their animals at home. And so the predators will feed on that. And they will really kind of get in that loved one who may have some cognitive difficulty, and they'll get in their head and make them believe by repetition, by telling lies and isolation, that their people just don't care about them anymore. And they will get them to sign documents like powers of attorney, get their names added to bank accounts. And then all of a sudden we have a situation where we really can't access our person anymore. Sometimes they change locations. They may take them out of state. All of these things obviously are red flags, and really send up a flare. Don't put it off. Take action as soon as you start to see any of these problems, because before you know it, the money will be gone and it will be untrackable. So it's really important, once we start to see these things happening, to really do an intervention as quickly as possible.
So how do you intervene? How do you take action? Because I know when you are dealing with someone who is starting to experience cognitive decline, it's really difficult to reason with that person because their ability to think rationally has declined. And so they're not going to necessarily listen to reason. And if you're warning them to hang up on those phone calls from scammers, they
Yes.
might forget. If you're, telling them that that caregiver is just trying to manipulate them. And yes, I do love you, mom. I'm not trying to steal your money,
Yeah.
but they're now suspicious and they're listening to that louder voice. How do you take action?
So hopefully before we have to take action, there is a good estate plan in place. So for example, when our people are fully capacitated and not suffering from exploitation from an exploitable brain, we hope to have a good solid estate plan in place. And as part of that estate planning, either through drafting of trust instruments or through a will, we would also have a durable power of attorney. And who they've designated on that durable power of attorney document is the one who can then take financial action if our principal, the person who signed the power of attorney document, starts to decline. So that would be step one, is at the very beginning, we want to set our stuff up. We have some provisions in Florida that actually allow us to do something called a pre-need consent against exploitation. Which is a document that we have basically all of our clients come in and I tell them what it is and they go, where do I sign? I've heard about my friends and loved ones who've been exploited and I don't want that to be me. So that pre-need consent against exploitation basically gives permission to our trusted contacts to lock our money down if later on we start to give it away. So, for example, I had some clients in this week, they were very fearful about becoming exploitable because they're both in their 90s and they added all three of their children to that pre-need consent against exploitation. And they both, were eager to sign it because if they start to become scammable or exploitable, they want to be sure that their children have the ability to lock their assets down. And that is really another technique, is using injunctions to freeze assets when we see them going out the door. In Florida, we have a specific statute that is an injunction against exploitation that's very useful in locking assets down. But injunctions are available in every state in the United States. So there's always the option when we see that there's a financial risk of harm to go into any court in the US and ask the court to freeze assets if you can prove that there's some shenanigans going on. So I would encourage you to really look at your state's laws on exploitation, become familiar with them, and then take the action to lock assets down. But you're right. When we go to talk to a victim in the middle of them being exploited, you may not be the loudest voice. You're definitely not the voice that has been repeating over and over again. Your daughter Shannon is trying to exploit you. Your daughter Shannon has stolen money from you. Here, look at this bank statement. Even though, the bank statement may not be clear, they just grab onto these things and repeat, and talk louder and louder. And then that becomes belief. So what we have to do is really separate the exploiter from our victim. And what we have in Florida is the ability to separate or create a no contact provision with that exploiter from our victim as part of the injunction process. So a separation from the perpetrator is the key. And sometimes it's very easy by doing the injunction against exploitation. Sometimes it's more challenging. And sometimes it requires good old fashioned, Mom, how would you like to come on vacation with me for a week? How would you like to spend some time with the grandkids at my house in, wherever, really getting some time, and don't try to get them to be persuaded in a day. It took a long time for them to get exploitable by this stranger. It's going to take you a little time to get them back. But the key is repetition, coming back to the truth of what is really happening, repeating it. And hopefully by the end of that stay that they've made with you, you'll make some progress in kind of explaining what the real facts are that are going on. sometimes the only alternative is guardianship. So, we do that a lot where we have an exploitation case, and what we have to do is actually go into court and show the judge, look, this person really cannot manage their assets anymore. They're giving it away to all these scammers. This person exploited them. We have caregiver support, caregiver exploitation over here. And at that point, the assets will go into a protected guardianship or into a trust. If you have a trust-based plan, the successor trustee can step in and become the gatekeeper of the assets. So there's a lot of tools to use. The best tools are the ones that are done when our person is not exploitable, encouraging them to get their estate plans in place. But if it's too late, and if that estate plan has changed, because that can also be part of our exploiter's strategy, they'll get a new will, they'll get a new durable power of attorney, get a new trust, all those things. Sometimes exploiters are savvy enough to do those things. And in those cases, it does sometimes require a guardianship or engaging in other types of civil litigation in order to undo those things that have happened.
If you are already your parents' power of attorney, would you
Yes.
need to go through to get a guardianship? Why is
Normally,
that?
no. Normally, you
Okay.
don't. But so, if what we're dealing with is someone who did another power of attorney after yours, then you would have to go through a process to set aside their later dated power of attorney to show that it was invalid in order to go back to your previous power of attorney document. So, and yes, you're right. Normally, most states in the United States have something called a less restrictive alternative to guardianship, which would allow an agent under power of attorney to be the financial decision maker. And we like that because that allows us to avoid having a court supervise every dime that goes in and out of a guardianship. And you've said in advance, I want my loved one to be the one who manages my finances, not the court. So, in those situations where we do have a previous power of attorney, sometimes it can take a little effort to separate their assets from the later signed power of attorney that was done, obviously either under duress or by fraud, or when someone really wasn't capacitated anymore to execute that document.
So clearly using the legal system will help when there is serious exploitation like this.
Yeah.
What about the smaller scams that any of us could easily fall prey to, especially if you are dealing with perhaps a parent who is starting to forget things? I mean, this happened with my mother. She would get scam calls, someone telling her that she had won a prize and she had to wire money to collect her prize. And she was so convinced that she had to wire this money to claim this prize that she had not even won. And I spent hours at her house, fending off those calls and trying to convince her that no, indeed, she did not need to wire money. What do you do in those situations that can happen day in and day out? They're getting calls, they're getting emails, they're getting all these solicitations in the mail. How do you protect your parents against those smaller incidents that can clearly add up over time if they're constantly giving away $100 here and $100 there?
Yeah, it's really difficult. To give you an idea of how difficult it is, we actually had one of our experts take us into the dark web so that we could see exactly where our vulnerable victims' information was being sold, right? So I know a lot of us are familiar with an email that might look suspicious when we see it and things are spelled wrong, like Wells Fargo is spelled with one L, right? So we don't respond to it. We know that it's not real. But for the exploitable brain, they will not see those small errors. And they may fall victim to that phishing, is what they call it, that phishing email. And the reason that those errors exist in that phishing email is because they don't want people who are completely competent to respond. They're looking for people who miss the error and who then respond. And those are the people who end up with their information being sold on the dark web. And so, oftentimes what we'll find is that the information that's being sold on the dark web, for example, if they get a credit card number Somebody got into somebody's computer and they get a credit card number, you'll see that information available for sale on the dark web. And this is going to floor you. They actually have like this honor system among thieves. So if that account is closed, you get your dark web money back. So, I mean, this is a very sophisticated process where they are selling information. And once you become someone who responds to that call, your information becomes more valuable. So, it doesn't happen to everyone that we all get, a zillion calls a day. It happens to the people who have fallen victim to the scam. Their value as a product on the dark web becomes more and more valuable. So, that's why you see the increase. And sometimes, like what we know now, is that organized crime across the entire world has gotten really sophisticated and involved with exploitable victims. And so what that means is if you are exploitable and you fall victim to a scam like 1 or 2 times, your information is sold. And because the criminal, enterprises are so sophisticated now, they may send someone to your house. So if you're someone who's exploitable and they've seen that you have sufficient assets, they will put boots on the ground where you are and send somebody out to say, like, your tree is going to fall on your house. I'm a licensed contractor. Here's my card. It's $15,000 up front, and then you pay us another $15,000 when we cut it down, and then you never see them again. So once they've targeted you, the sophistication of the organized crime related to these enterprises will continue to target you until your assets are made safe. So what can you do? Okay, so it's really hard. And that's why I personally was so excited to see the Carefull app come into play. It was something that I'd been looking for a long time, because I have so many, sad stories about people and their families who felt powerless over preventing this type of situation. And what I love about the Carefull app is that what it does is it allows my clients, my senior who's trying to age gracefully, they're in the sunset of their life. They want to maintain as much independence as possible, but they have fear. They have really 2 fears. They fear getting exploited, but they also fear that someone's going to take over their life. And so it's a balance between those 2 things. What the Carefull app does is it allows for our person to maintain complete control over their assets. No one can, step in and lock their assets down. They maintain control, but an alert is sent out to our trusted loved ones when you pay a bill twice, or when you don't pay a bill, or when you're sending money to a suspicious entity that through the Carefull app algorithm has, created a process where we know that this is somebody who is a scammer. And so having that really notification and monitoring really provides that sense of safety to our client that they're not going to be exploited, or they might get exploited one time, but that's going to be it. But also allows them to maintain their independence and their sense of like, I'm still in charge. Like, I can still manage my stuff as long as I can make good decisions. So, that is a very valuable tool, and one that we've been excited to start using with our clients who really do truly, I have yet to have a client come in and say they didn't want to have that added protection against exploitation. They've seen people lose everything, and they do not want that to happen to them. So it's been very valuable. So that app is one product that we use a lot. And then also trust-based planning, making sure that you have successor trustees who can step in and become gatekeepers for your assets. That is another very valuable tool. Finra, which is really a national organization that helps to keep financial entities, custodians. They are like a supervisor of that. They actually have a rule now that allows financial advisors and I'm not saying the right word, but like banks and security companies, they're allowed to actually freeze assets for up to 5 days if they see something that looks like it's fraud or it's some sort of financial scam. They can actually freeze assets down now. So we're seeing that happen more commonly as well. And in the state of Florida, we have something called the prudent investor law that allows people to, again, freeze assets down when they think a scam is occurring in Florida. So it's good. There's some more tools that are coming online. But in general, you know, we just have to be super alert, get good estate plans in place, and then use tools like the Carefull app to monitor what is happening and then to take action. You cannot step back and say like, I'll deal with it later. You got to get in there and you've got to really start to lean into the problem, even though initially you're going to get a lot of pushback from our victim.
I agree. Monitoring is so important, especially if you're not there in the same city as your parents. You can't check in on them regularly. You need to be watching what's going on behind the scenes. And you're not going to know what's happening in their bank account. That's probably not going to come out in a conversation. Like you said, people are often embarrassed if they become victims and they're not going to necessarily tell you. I mean, mom might tell you that she couldn't find the car keys today, but she's not going to necessarily say, hey, I just bought a gift card for $100 at Home Depot and sent it to some guy who told me that I owed money on my taxes. And
Right.
so I agree, monitoring is key. And even if you are there,
Yeah.
again, you're not seeing what's going on with their money, and you've got to have a way to keep tabs to
Yes.
protect your parents, especially if there is cognitive decline. And that monitoring has to start right away, because that financial decision making declines in the very early stage of Alzheimer's. I mean, there's research out there that shows that actually a pattern of missed and late bill payments will crop up 6 years before there's even a diagnosis of dementia. So your parents could be making mistakes with their money before you even notice that they're having trouble with their memory. And so, like I said, you've got to be monitoring from the get-go.
And I would also add to that, you know, we do see cognitive decline in a lot of cases with exploitation, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes that thinning of the cortical insula happens before we even see any of the signs of dementia, you know, where they become suggestible and very vulnerable to exploitation. Like I had a situation where we had a lady and she was in her mid 40s and, you know, she went to the bank, did exactly what this guy had told her. He was going to arrest her. And, you know, when she looked at her phone, it looked like he was calling from a local Florida police department. And so, you know, you would never, she was actually a clinical psychologist and had small children and very active. So sometimes you're going to see the combination of it being a senior, but sometimes it may just be a vulnerability that's separate and apart from any kind of cognitive indicators. So we just have to be super aware that people who may seem very, very capable and active and working and whatever, they may still have an exploitable brain and they may still fall victim to scams. So, you know, we just have to be on constant alert for everyone. But for the most part, my experience has been that we're seeing the exploitability more so in our seniors, and particularly as they reach the age. For women, it's like 92 or 93. I'm sorry, gentlemen, but you're in like the mid 80s. Men seem to kind of exhibit some of these exploitability traits a little bit earlier than the women do. You know, and I've often spoken to groups, and I will always have someone in the back saying, I'm 97, I'm smarter than you, you know, and usually they're right. So, you know, those are I'm saying this is a special class of people that have these changes to the brain, but it doesn't apply to everyone. And so, you know, we also have to be careful not to assume that older people are exploitable, because they're not all exploitable. Some of them, like our young lady tells us, some of them are sharper than we are. So, we want to make sure that we're not throwing, the baby out with the bathwater by making any kind of generalizations about seniors. But at the same time, we do want to be on the lookout, because once the money leaves their account, it goes typically, and I've actually talked to an FBI agent about this, because we had a case where it was like $300,000. We're trying to track it. And it had gone through a country in Africa that did not have agreements with the United States to exchange information. And so that's really where the trail of money breaks down. So even when you give away, a significant amount of money and you think, oh, the FBI will be able to track this for me, when it goes through one of those countries that won't exchange information with the FBI, the trail is lost forever and you're never going to get the money back. So they are always putting it through some of these countries in North Africa where we don't have the ability to track where the funds went from there. And then, you're just out of luck. So once the money's gone, it's really almost impossible to get it back.
Let me ask you one more question. You mentioned several times the importance of planning and having those estate planning documents in place, drafting them while you're still mentally competent. However, you also mentioned that you had a client, I believe, whose daughter was taking advantage of her, taking advantage of the trust, using it for her own benefit. What
Right.
advice do you have for people when it comes to choosing that trusted person, the family member, the family friend, to be your power of attorney, to be your trustee, to be the executor of your will? How do you choose the right person?
That is such a great question. And the answer is, it's hard. It's hard. And so oftentimes what I do is I say, why not choose both your kids? Have one. So we have a process in Florida, and I'm pretty sure this is the same across the nation, where you can have two powers of attorney at the same time operating independently of each other. So in cases like that, I can have both of my daughters be my agents under power of attorney, and they operate independently. So it doesn't require two signatures on every check. But at the same time, they can divide and conquer. So one can pay my bills, one can, manage my contracts or whatever, can do the day-to-day stuff. And then there's a check and balance there, right? So one of them does not hold all of the information. They both can access information. And so they both can kind of watch each other to make sure that, no one is engaging in money's coming for their own benefit. So picking two people, if you feel like that's something that's available to you, is often a good way to spread the responsibility, but also to give yourself a bit of a check and a balance. But if you have family members that struggle financially, or they're in a marriage where the spouse is very controlling and may be the one directing your agent to do things that you've never really been comfortable with during, your full capacity, it's best not to choose those types of people. You always want to choose someone who's done well financially for themselves, who has been above board, who's honest, doesn't have any, crime situations in their history. Someone who's not struggling from drug or alcohol addiction is always important. But also just someone who you could imagine today could take over for you. A lot of people say, well, if I need it, then it should be this person. Hopefully they'll get their affairs in order by then. No, it could happen tomorrow. And when you sign your power of attorney, guess what? The authority vests immediately. When you sign it, your agent gets the power. So, and in Florida, and I think it's true in most states, a copy is just as good as the original. So you want to keep your document very safe. You don't want to leave it lying around where someone could white out the name and put their name in, because a copy is just as good as an original. You also want to really kind of have a conversation with your agent and say, I've selected you, but I want you to understand that if you abuse it, it's a crime. And so, under most states' law, well, under every single state in the nation, if an agent steals money for their own self, it is a crime and they will be prosecuted today wasn't true maybe 20 years ago, but today it's not a civil matter, it's a crime. So I always try and encourage our principals to have those kinds of conversations with their loved ones. Look, it's a crime, so don't mess around. I'm putting you in charge, but I trust you. But realize that if you don't take this responsibility seriously, you can be criminally charged, and that usually ends up being somewhat helpful. But yeah, choose your people very wisely. Sometimes there are fiduciaries like banks, or there's independent fiduciaries like professional guardians who may be willing to serve in that role. If you don't have any family members that you trust, there may be a fee that's required as part of that process, but sometimes it's worth it, to have somebody who's a fiduciary, bonded, insured, to manage your affairs, because it's just that important.
I think too, it's important for people to realize that once they name a power of attorney, it's not set in stone. If they've chosen the wrong person, they can name someone else, right?
That's right. That's right. You can always change it.
You can always change it. Well, thank you, Shannon. These tips are wonderful. I mean, certainly a lot of what you said is terrifying,
I know.
but it's important for people to realize what's going on out there and how diligent we all need to be to protect our finances and to protect our parents' finances. So thank you.